Picture this: you board a plane, expecting a routine flight, but suddenly something unimaginable happens. The pilot, the person entrusted with your safety, refuses to fly. Why? There is a pregnant black woman on board. Shock spreads throughout the cabin. No one can believe what is happening. It is a situation that sends shivers down your spine. Before we continue, let's do this. Write in the comments what your name is and what city or country you are watching this video from. We really appreciate each and every one of you. You are incredibly important to us. Your comments help us grow and promote our channel, and we are truly grateful for your support. Each of you is the heart of our community, and we will never stop repeating how important you are to us. Enjoy watching. The cabin was filled with the gentle hum that is typical at the start of any flight. People were settling into their seats, some already fastening their seatbelts, and the flight attendants were smiling and greeting everyone as they entered. No one expected this flight to be anything other than another flight from point A to point B. Among the passengers was a young, pregnant woman, black, with visible fatigue on her face. She was carefully settling into her seat, trying not to draw attention to herself. The soft rustling of bags, the muffled conversations, all this created the feeling of an ordinary day, when everyone was lost in their own thoughts and expectations. But in the cockpit, the atmosphere was different. One detail caught the captain's attention. His gaze fell on the passenger list. He frowned when he saw one name. A dull irritation began to build inside him as he looked out the window into the cabin, trying to find someone he did not think should be on board. His eyes fell on the black woman occupying the window seat. She looked calm, but to him her presence was an insult. Deep down, he had long harbored a distaste for people like her. These people, he thought, should not have the same privileges as everyone else. He felt anger spreading through his body. She was more than just a passenger to him. She symbolized everything he thought was wrong with the world. And now she was sitting on his plane. Tension began to slowly fill the air, as if something ominous was brewing. The passengers didn't notice yet, but the pilot already knew. He wasn't going to let this flight go the way they all expected. The pilot couldn't calm down. An unpleasant feeling spread through his body, causing his hands to clench into fists. He kept his eyes on the black woman, who seemed completely unaware of the irritant she had become for him. She simply sat by the window, rubbing her stomach, occasionally glancing out the window, perhaps thinking about the upcoming flight or what awaited her upon arrival. But to the pilot, she was more than just a passenger. In his eyes, she had become a symbol of everything he hated. His thoughts grew darker and more cruel. How dare she even come on my plane? Flashed through his mind. He remembered how people like her used to know their place and thought with indignation that the world had become too lenient, especially towards people like her, black people. And now she not only dared to fly on his plane, but she was pregnant. It seemed like a personal insult to him. Sighing with suppressed anger, he climbed out of his seat and headed for the exit of the cockpit. No, this is simply unacceptable, he thought, the words he would say spinning around in his head. Each one was charged with hatred and contempt. His heart was beating faster with adrenaline, fueled by anger and hostility. The pilot opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. His figure looked menacing against the calm passengers still settling into their seats. He walked confidently straight to where the woman was sitting. His face was grim, and the passengers on either side of him sensed that something was wrong. They watched him with wary eyes. The pilot stopped in the aisle, about 2 meters from the woman. Her gaze met his, and for a moment there was a flash of confusion in her eyes. She didn't know that this look was the beginning of real horror. The pilot leaned toward her, barely containing his anger. His voice was cold and harsh. "You think you deserve to be here?" he said, barely containing his anger. "You got on this plane and you think that's okay?" The woman, clearly confused, looked at him with bewilderment. She tried to answer, but her words were drowned out by the noise of the crowd, which began to look around. The passengers watched the scene with bated breath, feeling how something unnatural permeated the air. The pilot didn't let her continue. "You don't belong on this plane," he said with disdain. "I'm not going to take any chances for the likes of you." The woman was in shock and couldn't understand what was happening. She instinctively pressed her hands to her stomach, as if protecting her unborn child. Her heart was pounding, and she couldn't believe that this man, who was responsible for their safety, was so openly displaying hatred. The situation was rapidly escalating, and now all the passengers froze, watching what would happen next. The pilot, filled with rage, stood in the center of the aisle, like a figurehead about to pass judgment. The air in the cabin began to thicken with tension. The passengers sat in shock, not believing their eyes and ears. Many thought that everything that was happening was nothing more than an absurd misunderstanding that was about to be resolved. But the pilot's next statement confused even the calmest of them. "I refuse to fly with her on board," he suddenly shouted, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. The passengers froze. At first, no one could understand what he was talking about, but then he gestured to the woman. The black pregnant passenger, whom he had already humiliated, sat in complete confusion, feeling the eyes of the crowd on her. Her eyes were filled with fear and helplessness. "I will not fly this plane with people like her on board," the pilot continued, his words laced with hatred. This statement struck everyone like a bolt from the blue. A mixture of disbelief and horror could be read in the passengers' eyes. How could the person entrusted with their lives so openly display hatred and racism? But the pilot, ignoring their reactions, continued to insist. "Get out of here," he snapped at the woman, leaning closer to her, his voice dripping with contempt. "You don't deserve to be on this plane. I won't endanger other passengers for the likes of you." The passengers began to whisper, and the indignation quickly grew, but no one dared to intervene. Everyone was so stunned by his aggression and directness that they did not know how to react. Some turned away, some clenched their fists in anger, but there was tension in the air, ready to explode. The woman, who had been trying to remain calm, suddenly felt her heart squeeze with fear and humiliation. Tears welled up in her eyes. She felt like this was a nightmare that had to end. She couldn't believe that in the 21st century she was facing such blatant racism in front of everyone. The pilot did not retreat. His face expressed only contempt and anger. He turned to the other passengers, as if expecting their support. "If anyone thinks I'm overreacting," he said loudly, "you can get off this plane too. I'm not going to fly with anyone who's willing to support people like her." These words sounded like an ultimatum, and this was the signal that woke the crowd. Finally, cries of protest began to be heard among the passengers. People began to come out of their stupor and realize that they had witnessed a real act of hatred. "This is unacceptable," someone shouted from the back rows. "Are you serious?" Another passenger supported him, not believing his ears. But at that moment something unexpected happened. A couple of people sitting near the pilot looked at each other and took his side. "Maybe he's right," one man said reluctantly, clearly unwilling to risk his convictions. "We have the right to choose who we fly with." These words were like a punch in the gut for those who were in shock from what was happening. A gloomy silence enveloped the plane again, but this time it was even more oppressive. It seemed that some of the passengers began to agree with the pilot. The woman sat there in a daze, her face covered in tears. It felt like the whole world had collapsed around her, and no one was ready to help. The plane's cabin, filled with an anxious silence, now felt like a taut string about to snap. Passengers glanced nervously at each other, feeling the situation spiraling out of control. The woman sitting by the window continued to press her hands to her stomach, her eyes full of tears and fear. She could not believe that she had become the target of such hatred, especially in such a public place. The pilot had no intention of stopping. He felt his grip on the situation growing stronger, and his voice took on an even more brutal tone. "You think you can just get on this plane like everything is normal?" he said coldly, looking down at the woman. "You have no idea how many people here are against you flying with us." Her voice, trembling with fear, tried to break through the tears. I just want to get home. Please, I need to fly." "Fly?" the pilot interrupted, grinning. "You don't even deserve a place here. Do you understand that? You and your..." His gaze slid to her stomach. "Like you, they destroy everything they touch. How dare you even ask for a flight?" The woman's eyes filled with tears again. She looked around, hoping to see someone who would stand up for her, but many passengers turned away or lowered their heads. Only a few tried to speak, but fear and shock kept them silent. An atmosphere of horror enveloped the entire plane like a fog. "This is outrageous." The man sitting in the next row finally couldn't stand it. "She has as much right to be here as anyone else." His voice was full of anger, but he couldn't hide the trembling, because he was standing in front of the person on whom their safety depended. The pilot turned to face him, and a cold fire flashed in his eyes. "Her presence is a threat to all of us. Do you want to risk your flight because of her?" His words sounded as if he wanted to strike fear into anyone who dared to object. "You can leave the plane too, if you think I'm wrong." The man fell silent, and doubt flashed across his face. Silence fell over the salon again. Did you hear that? The pilot turned to the woman again. No one here wants to fly with you, even if they don't say it out loud. They agree. You're just a burden to all of us. That's not true, the woman muttered hoarsely, her voice almost breaking under the weight of humiliation. I'm not hurting anyone. Harm? The pilot laughed, his laughter cold and cruel. You cause harm by existing here, by your appearance, by your pretensions to be on our level. Some of the passengers were whispering something under their breath. Others were just silently watching what was happening. The woman tried to speak again, her voice trembling. Please, I didn't mean to inconvenience anyone. I just need to fly. I have a child. The pilot interrupted her with obvious mockery. Your child? Do you think anyone here cares about him? He looked mockingly at the passengers, as if hoping that someone would support him. No one cares about you and your future. You are just creating problems for all of us. His words echoed through the cabin like hammer blows on steel walls. The woman, still clutching her stomach, was now afraid that something terrible could happen at any moment. Her breathing became ragged. She felt the space around her narrowing. Enough! Another woman shouted from the back row. Her voice broke the silence like thunder. This is unacceptable. We can't just stand by and watch you humiliate her. The pilot turned sharply to her. If you don't like it, you can get out too, he growled. I said I'm not flying with her on board, and that's my decision. The pilot's words hung in the air like toxic smoke, filling the cabin. The woman, losing her last bits of strength, realized that her fear had become the center of this hell. The passengers looked at each other, not knowing how to react. A feeling of hopelessness filled the space. The atmosphere was tense to the limit, and the time had come when not only words but also actions began to speak louder than any expressions. The pilot, feeling the support of several passengers, continued to build tension. He towered over everyone, like a dictator, asserting his authority. I cannot take responsibility for what may happen to you because of her presence, he stated, his voice full of self-satisfaction. I can see how some of you may make excuses for her, but there are rules in this world, and those who do not follow them should know that they will be cast out. The man who had previously stood up for the woman could not stand it any longer. You yourself are violating the rules of humanity. It's disgusting. His voice trembled with anger, but the pilot only chuckled. Humanity? It's just a word. I'm talking about reality, the pilot replied with disdain, his eyes blazing with hatred. You can hide behind words as much as you like, but I see her true face. She's a threat to our safety. We are all on this plane as a team, another passenger shouted. We can't let hate dictate our actions. But the words were nothing. They were looked at as absurd, and the pilot was not going to stop. He turned his attention to the woman, her exhausted face, full of tears and fear. This only spurred his hatred. You think your life matters? He cried, his voice hard as steel. You're just another statistic. Being pregnant is no excuse for you to be here. There's no place for your kind here. The woman's lips trembled, and she was finally able to utter words that sounded like a cry from the depths of her soul. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm just a human being. Like all of you, I don't deserve to be treated like this. The pilot laughed, and his laugh was full of poison. A man, he growled. You are not a man to me. You are a mistake of nature. You are a creature that must be isolated. Learn to understand this. The crowd froze. One woman sitting with the children jumped up, her eyes full of tears. How can you say that? It's disgusting. Her voice trembled with rage and pain. We are all equal. The pilot, however, seemed not to hear her. He continued to look at the pregnant woman, as if he was about to do something terrible. In the eyes of everyone sitting, in the air, there was fear that made you want to run away. It was unknown where all this would lead. The woman, realizing that her life and the life of her unborn child were in the hands of a man who clearly did not value them, suddenly felt herself losing confidence. She turned to the other passengers, her voice quieter, full of despair. Please help me. I don't want my child to grow up in such a world. Her words acted like a spark. Voices of indignation began to be heard in the hall, but the pilot only looked at them with disdain. You're all just pathetic shells, he said, pushing away the disagreement. I'm not going to leave. She's going to get out or I'm not taking this flight. The situation was heating up to the limit. Hatred and fear were flying inside the cabin, and no one knew how it would end. Every word the pilot said burned like fire, and the atmosphere itself began to fill not only with indignation, but also with horror. The hatred that the pilot had released, like a malevolent spirit, now pierced the entire plane. The woman sat, almost without hope. Her heart was clenched with fear, and her mind was spinning with thoughts of what to do next. There was a piercing silence around her, but there was something more in it, a dull, heavy tension, ready to explode. The pilot, seated on his throne of power, continued to look down on the women and children in the seats, and this only spurred him on. His confidence grew, and he felt not only right, but also unpunished. This encouraged him, and he seemed to enjoy the moment. "I'm not leaving until you take her away," he repeated like it was a mantra, his eyes blazing with hatred and his lips twisted into a sneer. The man who had previously tried to protect the woman stood up again and, gathering his courage, said, "I can't sit and watch this. It's simply unacceptable. If anyone should go, it's you." "Yes," another woman chimed in, "you show us the worst side of humanity." The pilot turned sharply towards them, his voice shaking with rage. "You can say what you want, but that woman is an abomination. I will not let my plane take off with her on board. She's just proof of how far we have come in our progress. I know it is not for everyone, and you all need to realize that." The salon began to fill with frantic shouts and cries. People who had been silent before suddenly raised their heads, and now each of them was eager to express their opinion. Some tore off the masks of indifference, and their discontent became more acute. "We're all here to fly together," a man from the back row shouted. "You don't like it? Get up and leave." The pilot felt his power begin to dissipate. He tried to regain control, but every word he said only fueled the anger among the passengers. "And if I told you it was your choice?" he smirked. "If you want to be with her, you'll have to accept the responsibility. I'm not going to carry that burden." "It's not a burden, it's life," the woman with the children shouted, her voice full of emotion. "You have to know what to do, it's your job." The pilot, losing his patience, again turned his anger on the pregnant woman. "You're no good," he said, his voice growing even more menacing. "You're just a dirty mistake that got on board. No one wants to deal with you." It was like a bolt of lightning. The woman sat there speechless, her breathing ragged, and her eyes filled with tears again. She could no longer hold back and felt the universal justice leaving her. "I cannot allow the likes of you to exist among us," the pilot whispered, and his words sounded as if he was swearing something evil. The crowd around him roared, and the tension turned to rage. Passengers began to rise from their seats, some whispering calls to action, some simply unable to contain their emotions and cursing. And then, in the midst of this general panic, someone shouted, "I can't stand this anymore. If he doesn't want to fly with her, let him leave himself." These words became a spark that ignited anger in the hearts of the passengers. Some began to stand up and support the pregnant woman, hugging her, trying to create a protective circle around her. "We are together, and we will not let him do this," the woman with the children cried, and her words lit a spark of hope. The situation had reached its breaking point, and now no one could predict how it would all end. The pilot found himself in the center of a storm created by his own actions, and no one knew what it would mean for him, for the woman, and for all the passengers on board. The excitement in the cabin reached its peak. Passengers, furious at the pilot's actions, united, ready to defend the pregnant woman. This was a turning point, when hatred and fear mixed, creating an atmosphere full of tension and threat. Each of them felt that in their hands was not only the fate of the woman, but the fate of the entire flight. The pilot, realizing that his power was under threat, closed his eyes to the reality that was unfolding around him. He looked at the crowd with disdain. His voice became icy and menacing. "If you don't remove her, I'll just cancel this flight," he said, and his words were laced with not only hatred but also fear. "I'm not going to risk my career for your undeserved wealth." The crowd responded with a dull murmur. The woman, still clutching her stomach, was breathing with difficulty. She felt her heart pounding in unison with the excitement in the cabin, and despair was consuming her. "We won't leave her," shouted the man, who had once again come to the defense. "She doesn't deserve this humiliation. We are all human." The pilot stepped forward, his face stern and sullen. "People," he cried, his voice rolling through the cabin like thunder, "people who allow such shortcomings to exist among us. She is not a person. She is a disgrace that should not be here." The room exploded with anger, but the pilot continued, as if lost in his own world of hatred. "You really want to take her with you?" he said, his voice growing even more sullen. This evens the score. As if you weren't ashamed. This isn't just an insult to me, but to all of you. Are you prepared to take the consequences? Some of the passengers began to make noise, but many were still afraid. They were unsure how to react to such blatant hatred. The pilot sensed this, and his confidence only grew. "You are all just like her," he said with contempt, his voice growing more sullen. "Wear it as a badge of shame and deny your identity. All of you," he pointed at them. "You are simply those who are willing to accept it. How I pity you all." The words were like a cold shower. The passengers' eyes widened in shock, and doubts began to creep in. Some tried to regain control of the situation, but fear stood between them and true justice. "We will not allow her to be humiliated," the same man shouted again, his voice filled with determination, but he could feel fear growing within him. "This is not just a person. This is a future mother." The pilot, like a ferocious beast, moved forward even more. His face turned red with anger, and he turned to the man. "If you are so wise, go out to her and watch how your kindness leads to chaos. How far from reality you are. Do you think you can change this world? It hates people like you." The woman could no longer contain herself. Her voice broke into a scream. "I'm not asking for mercy. I just want my child to be born in a safe place, in a world without hatred and racism." But the pilot, not listening to her, continued, "You won't be able to raise a normal person. You'll cripple him, just like you crippled yourself. Why do we need people like you? Why should we risk ourselves for your hopes?" His words were like a knife piercing her heart, and though she tried to remain strong, a feeling of hopelessness crept into her soul. Her tears rolled down her cheeks like rivulets of hot pain. Those who supported her began to stand up, but it was no longer so easy. Uncertainty was creeping into every heart, and the threat posed by the pilot was becoming more and more real. "I won't tolerate this anymore," someone shouted, and that was the signal for everyone. "We won't let you do this to her. This isn't just an insult, it's an atrocity." The pilot finally felt his interrupted power begin to crumble. He took a step closer, expressing complete contempt for the woman and everyone who supported her. "Try to do anything, and I will do everything to stop this flight from taking off, and you will all stay here to feel what it is like to be exiled from the world of normality." The situation escalated to the limit. The anger of the passengers supporting the pregnant woman escalated into a full-fledged rebellion. People began to leave their seats, and although their fear of the pilot was great, the desire to protect the woman outweighed it. Everyone felt that this situation had become more than just a conflict on board an airplane. It was a clash with hatred, prejudice, and human dignity. The pilot, seeing that control was slipping away, took a step back and chuckled. "Do you think your screams will change anything? They're just words that fly through the air like soap bubbles. I see you all descending into chaos, and it only plays into my hands." Voices of indignation were heard among the crowd. "We are not afraid of you," one of the passengers shouted, coming closer. "You have no right to do this. You are just a man, just like us, and your hatred will no longer rule us." But the pilot, having gained confidence, continued, "You don't understand who's in charge here. I'm in control of this situation. All of you must obey, or the consequences will be dire. You'll be in trouble." His words fueled the anger, and the crowd began to circle around him like an angry flock. Every passenger knew that this moment could be decisive. They moved closer to the pilot, as if they wanted to encircle him. "You have no right to intimidate us," said one of the women standing in front. Her voice was full of determination. "We are here to support each other, and you cannot change that." The pilot, not wanting to back down, blurted out, "You are not worth a dime. If I were your boss, I would fire you all. You are nothing. Your struggle is meaningless. It is just time to learn that the world is not what you want it to be." "We will not tolerate your racism," shouted another passenger. "It is not only a disgrace to you, but to all of us who tolerate this behavior. You serve us, not we you." The situation developed and the tension reached its peak. The pilot felt the passengers around him turning into one, and it was astonishing. In the eyes of those who supported him, he saw only hatred, and in others, fear, but also determination. He tried to rise above everyone, but it did not work anymore. "I will not speak to you anymore," he shouted, his voice becoming shrill. "I will tell you that this woman is dangerous, and if any of you stand up for her, you will all regret it." As if in response to his threats, muffled voices came from the crowd. "We are not afraid," came the cries of support. "We stand for the truth." The warmth of unity grew and the passengers began to embrace each other, creating a chain of support around the pregnant woman. The pilot realized that his words no longer had power, and his worldview collided with the reality he had been trying to escape. "I want you to know," he said, stepping back, "that you will pay for this moment. I will not let it happen." But at that moment one of the passengers, a man who had already tried to stand up for the woman more than once, stood up in front and said, "If we all remain silent, then this will be the beginning of the end. We will not allow you to insult her. If you want this to end, then you have only one way out: to leave." Cries of support echoed throughout the cabin like a storm, growing with each new word. "We won't let her go as long as you're here," the woman with the children shouted. "We're all people, and we're here to protect each other." The pilot began to realize that his time was running out. This group of people, united, was not only united against him, but also against what he represented. He was surrounded not only by passive resistance, but also by an active struggle for justice. "I won't stand here any longer," he said, his voice shaking with rage and fear. "If you don't want me to take this on myself, you better back off." "We will not back down," the same passenger replied, his voice firmer. "We will not let hatred rule our lives." This confrontation was the moment of truth. The pilot felt his power slipping away, and in that moment he finally realized that the world he lived in no longer mattered. The passengers were ready to go all the way, and their determination became a barrier to his hatred. The situation in the cabin was becoming increasingly tense. The passengers, united, were becoming more confident in their actions, and the fear that had previously gripped them began to dissipate like fog in the sun. The pilot, who had once stood at the pinnacle of his power, now felt isolated and on the defensive. "Get her off," he shouted again, his voice shaking with rage. "If you want to fly, get this disgraceful woman off board." The crowd began to murmur angrily. The woman sitting with her belly now felt not only fear, but also support. She looked at the people around her, and her heart filled with gratitude. She felt that this was not just her battle, but a common cause. "This isn't just about her," one woman in the crowd shouted. "This is about us, about our right to be here. We won't let hate rule." The man who had been standing in the foreground raised his hand and called for silence. The passengers froze, but the tension was still in the air. "Let's do this right," he said, his voice firm but calm. "We have to show this man that we're not afraid. We can be strong together. We don't have to tolerate this behavior." The pilot, seeing the unity among the passengers, felt his confidence begin to crack at the seams. Anger was brewing inside him, and he was ready to act to reassert his authority. "You are all naive," he said with contempt, his words full of malicious mockery. "You think you can change anything with one scream? You are nothing. All of you are just weak." "Weak?" exclaimed another passenger. "You are the weak, since you hide your hatred under the mask of professionalism. The weak are those who cannot bear differences." The pilot hissed furiously. "I see that you are all just a crowd, blindly following one thing. You think that you are creating something great, but in reality you are only fueling hatred." The passengers began shouting over each other, creating a powerful torrent of voices filled with anger and determination. The pilot's hatred was now just a spark that ignited the fire of their unity. "We are not here to support your indifference," one of the women cried, her voice resonating with a general determination. "We are here to stand for the truth, and we will not leave until we see this horror end." The pilot knew he was losing control, and a threat flashed in his eyes. "If you don't remove it, I'll make you all pay. I'll make sure you don't want to fly on this flight or any other." But these words only added fuel to the fire. The passengers began to gather together, preparing to fight his hatred. "We will not let you control our lives," the same man shouted, his voice even louder. "We are all here to live, and we will fight for what is right." At that moment, the woman, who had raised her hands carefully, said through tears of confidence, "We must create space for love and understanding. I am not asking for mercy. I just want us to be able to fly together, regardless of skin color, status or gender." The pilot, seeing that his words no longer had power, walked behind his seat in a rage. His aggression was now turning into complete madness. "This is a riot," he shouted, his voice piercing the air. "If you want me to leave, I'll just cancel this flight and let you all know who's really at fault here." But instead of being frightened, the crowd united even more. "We're not leaving," one of the women screamed. "You can't just get rid of us." The pilot felt himself losing control of the situation. The passengers no longer feared his threats. Instead, they became one, united in the fight for justice. This was their moment. And then, when his voice became muffled and full of malice, one of the men standing in the foreground looked straight into the pilot's eyes. "We will not allow you to speak to us this way. You are wrong, and we will do everything possible to change that." The situation had reached its breaking point. The pilot, seeing his power and control fading, knew he couldn't stop this moment. He was standing on the edge of an abyss, and now the only decision left was whether to retreat or continue the fight, which could lead to disaster for everyone on board. The pilot, feeling his power slipping away, stood on the edge of an abyss. Every word he said only strengthened the resolve of his passengers. He knew that this situation could turn against him, and now he had only one choice: either take decisive action or accept the consequences of his own biases. "Is this what you all want?" he said, looking at the passengers' worried faces. His voice was shaking with rage, but there was a hint of fear in it. "Do you want to cause a flight delay? Do you want to ruin your own plans?" The crowd that stood in defense of the pregnant woman only increased its unity. The woman, surrounded by support, felt her hope for justice grow. She looked at her defenders and, gathering her strength, said, "We are not against the delay. We are against hatred. I do not want my child to grow up in a world where he is judged by the color of his skin." The pilot, realizing that his words were not finding a response, began to look around in panic. "If you don't disperse, I'll call security," he said menacingly, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. "You'll all get flight bans, prohibitions," laughed one of the passengers. "We are not afraid of your threats. We have a right to be here, and we will stand for it." This was a turning point. Each of the passengers realized that their strength lay in their unity, and the fear they had felt before began to fade. They were no longer isolated individuals. They had become a collective, ready to fight hatred and prejudice. Gathering together, they began to chant, "We are people, we are equal." The pilot, realizing that his power was gone, felt a chill of fear run down his spine. He swayed, trying to maintain control, but his heart was pounding. "You're all just causing trouble. You're a disgrace," he shouted, his voice seeming to break with the strain. "I'll never let you set foot on my territory again. This is not your territory," one of the women shouted, her voice filling the entire cabin. "This is our world. We have the right to our votes and our elections." Suddenly the pilot saw that his threats had no effect. His eyes reflected only helplessness. Each of the passengers felt a flame ignite in their hearts. This was not just a fight for a pregnant woman, it was a fight for equality, for the right to life and safety. At this moment, one of the crew members, a young steward, came out from behind the partition and, looking at the situation, said, "This is not normal. We are here to serve passengers, not to watch as hatred fuels hostility. I support you, and we must all unite against this hatred." These words created another wave of support among the passengers. They began to feel that their struggle had not gone unnoticed. "If you need me to leave so you can continue, I will," the steward said, his voice confident, "but I will not leave my position until you resolve this situation." The pilot, realizing his world was falling apart, finally realized that his threat would not work. He quickly glanced at the woman with the belly, and in her eyes he saw not only fear, but determination. "I will never let this happen," he shouted, unable to contain his anger. But at that moment the crowd, chanting their slogans, again drowned out his voice. "We will not remain silent. We will not tolerate." A passenger stepped forward, took a step towards the pilot, and said, "You can try to scare us, but we are all here for the truth. You can't stop us." The pilot felt the ground slipping from under his feet. All his attempts to regain control only made the situation worse. He decided to take the last step to bring this dynamite situation to an explosion. "Okay," he said, his voice turning icy. "If that's what you want, I'll cancel the flight. I won't take off until that woman leaves the plane." The cabin was dead silent. The passengers looked at each other, and the threat hung in the air. Everyone understood that the situation had reached a critical point, and now a choice had been made. This was not just a conflict between the pilot and the passengers, this was a fight for their human dignity and the right to life. Not knowing what to do next, each of them realized that they had to act. The pilot's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The passengers, gathered in the fight for justice, instantly realized they were standing on the threshold of a historic moment. This flight had become a symbol of the fight against bias and hatred. and now they had the opportunity to change the course of events. But how? "We will not allow you to force us to make a decision that violates our rights," shouted the same passenger who had spoken in front. His voice sounded confident, and in it one could hear the support of the others. The pregnant woman, sitting in her place, raised her hand and, addressing everyone, said, "This is not just my fight. This is the fight of each of us. If we give up now, we will undermine the hope for the future for us and our children." The crowd was thrilled. Each passenger knew they were part of something bigger. This woman wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever experienced racism and prejudice. The pilot, standing his ground, looking at the solid mass of people, felt his position weakening. Fear glimmered in his eyes. He was not prepared for his words to cause such a storm of support. "If I cancel the flight," he said, but his voice was no longer as confident as before, "it will be your fault. Do you want your families to miss out on vacations? Do you want all of you to lose your money?" "No," one of the passengers replied. "It is you who decides what to do. We cannot let your hatred rule our lives." By this time, another steward, hearing the tension growing, came closer to the pilot and said, "We all understand that this is wrong. We cannot ignore what is happening on board. We have the right to a safe flight, and you have no right to threaten us." A murmur of approval went up from the passengers. Each new word from the steward only spurred their determination. Finally, when the situation reached its breaking point, the woman sitting next to the pregnant woman raised her hand and asked, "We can contact the captain. He must know what's going on." Passengers began to talk among themselves, creating a wave of support. "Yes, let's do it," one of the women screamed. "We have to call the airline and tell them what's going on here." The pilot saw the situation spiraling out of control. He tried to maintain his authority, but the support among the passengers only grew. Their unity became his greatest fear. "You shouldn't do this," he said, his voice growing increasingly sullen. "I won't have anyone interfere with my duties. You have already violated your duties," one of the passengers shouted. "You should be looking out for the safety of all of us, not threatening us." As a group, they began to think about how they could change the situation. The passengers began to discuss how to approach other crew members and ask them to intervene. In this supportive atmosphere, they became even more united. Suddenly, one of the men standing in the foreground stepped forward and said, "We have all the evidence of your threats. If you refuse to do your job, this will be the basis for a lawsuit against you. We will not let your racism pass by." The pilot, seeing his words begin to accumulate legal consequences, felt his power slipping away. He began to realize that he could lose not only his job, but his reputation as well. "You're all playing with fire," he shouted, his face turning red with rage. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," said the man standing in front of him, "it is you who do not understand who you are dealing with. We are here to defend our truth. Hatred has no place in our society." The passengers began to chant again, their voices merging into a powerful unity. "We are for justice. We are against hatred." This was the climax. The pilot, realizing that his ability to reduce everything to threats had been exhausted, began to feel defenseless. His aggression and hatred became obvious, and at this point he did not know how to proceed. The passengers, united in their opposition, could no longer retreat. They had made a choice. Each of them understood that this flight had become a symbol of the struggle for their rights, and they were ready to defend them to the end. The pilot, standing on the edge of his choice, realized that he could no longer remain in this role. At that moment, he had to decide what was more important to him, to continue his hatred or to go for reconciliation. The moments dragged on in tense silence, and the passengers, gathered in one impulse, looked at the pilot with anticipation. Each of their breaths felt like a reflection of their determination. The moment had come when they had to decide whether they were ready to stand up for their rights to the end, even if it meant fighting against the system. The pilot, realizing his authority was crumbling, looked at the faces of people who had seemed faceless to him before. Now they were full of emotion, anger, fear, determination. He knew his time was running out. "This is your last chance," he said, trying to retain some influence. "If you don't get rid of this woman, I'll cancel the flight, and then you'll all be in trouble." But instead of being scared, the passengers just grinned. Each new word from the pilot increased their sense of unity. One of the men standing in front began to speak. "We will not leave until this flight departs. We will not allow hatred to prevail over justice." The man's words reflected the general mood. The pilot, realizing that his attempts at intimidation were no longer working, took a step back, trying to collect his thoughts. "You think you can challenge me?" he said furiously, but now there was a note of desperation in his voice. "I've been trained to be a captain, and what does that change?" Another passenger responded, standing up for his defense. "You're still a human being, not a god. You have no right to treat people with contempt." The tension in the cabin was growing. Passengers began to realize that they had the power to change the situation. They began to unite, taking steps forward, encouraging each other. "Let's go to the management together," one of the women shouted, her voice confident. "If he can't perform his duties, we need to report it." The pilot felt his power slipping away before his eyes. He tried to scream, but his words were stuck in his throat. Instead, he stood up, filled with hatred and despair. "Don't you think you're taking on too much?" he said, his voice growing cold. "You'll regret it." "We will not regret it," someone from the crowd shouted. "We are proud to stand up for rights." The passengers began to chant again, their voices merging into a powerful unity, reflecting their inner strength. "We won't leave. We're not afraid." The pilot, realizing that his place was no longer in the cockpit, turned and headed for the exit. He knew that his authority was exhausted, and behind him he could hear the approving shouts of the passengers. As he reached the door, his resolve gave way. He quickly turned to the crowd and spoke with emphasis. "If you don't leave, I'll call security and have you all arrested for riot." "This is not a riot. This is a fight for justice," one of the women answered him. "We will stand here until you understand that hatred has no power over us." His face flushed with anger, and he took one last look at the crowd, clenching his hands convulsively. His voice was filled with rage. "I will not tolerate your insolence any longer." But these words no longer had any power. The passengers continued to chant, their unity becoming even more powerful. The pilot, feeling that this moment of his defeat had arrived, gave up. "Very well," he said bitterly. "So be it, but know that I can do it again when you have nothing left to hope for." With these words, he left the cabin, leaving behind a crowd full of determination and pride. They stood their ground, and this became a symbol of their struggle. Among them, the woman sitting in her seat smiled as she felt her fear evaporate. She realized that this situation was not just about her, but about each of them. Each of them was ready to defend their rights. The passengers began to huddle together, discussing how they could proceed. A new flame of hope was lit within them. They realized that perhaps they had taken a step toward change. This was their victory now, and they knew that their fight was just beginning. The pilot left the cockpit, leaving behind a turbulent sea of emotions. The passengers, still determined, felt that their fight was not over. Each of them understood that this situation could change not only their lives, but also the fate of many others who faced bias. Now they had to act. One of the men standing in front raised his hand, calling for attention. "We need to make a plan. We can't just stand here. We need to make our voices heard." The crowd gathered around him, and there were nods of agreement among them. A spark of hope lit up their eyes. "We need to reach out to the other crew members and explain to them what happened," the woman who was defending the pregnant passenger suggested. "They need to know that hatred cannot be normal." "Yes, that's true," another passenger chimed in. "If we report this to the airline, they will have to take action against this pilot." Everyone agreed, and this idea created an atmosphere of unity. They understood that now their forces were united, and each of them was ready to stand up for justice. Having gathered themselves, they approached the stewards, who, seeing the situation, looked confused. "We need to talk to you," one of the men said, his voice confident. "We just witnessed unacceptable behavior by the captain. He refused to fly because there was a pregnant black woman on board." Word of what had happened began to spread and the crew began exchanging glances. The stewards realized that the situation required immediate intervention. "This is simply unacceptable," said one of the stewards, gathering the other crew members around him. "We must act and report this." "Yes," the passengers supported him. "We must all unite against this." One of the flight attendants standing nearby nodded and said, "We need to report this to the help desk, but first we need to make sure the pregnant woman is safe." All eyes turned to her, and the passengers realized that they now needed to focus on the woman who had become the center of this entire struggle. She sat in her seat, clasping her hands tensely as the discussion around her went on. "How are you feeling?" asked one of the passengers, sitting down next to her. "I'm fine," the pregnant woman replied, trying to remain calm, although there was worry in her voice. "But I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen next." "Don't worry," said the other woman, hugging her. "We're here, and we won't let anyone bring you down. We'll fight for you." This moment of unity strengthened their resolve. They understood that they had a responsibility not only for themselves, but also for future generations. By this time the flight attendants had contacted the airline management and it was decided that they should speak to the pregnant woman and make sure she was okay. They approached her and one of the flight attendants said, "We deeply apologize for what happened. This behavior is unacceptable, and we will do everything possible to ensure your safety." The pregnant woman nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She felt that her voice was finally being heard, and it gave her strength. While they were talking, the chief steward entered the cabin and announced, "We want all passengers to know that this incident will be investigated. We have already called the deputy chief so that he can discuss the situation with you." The passengers breathed a sigh of relief. They realized that the situation was beginning to change, and this was a great achievement for them. "Thank you," the pregnant woman said, her voice full of gratitude. "I just want my baby to be safe." Now that they knew they had the support of the crew, the passengers felt more confident. They began to discuss how they could use the incident to raise awareness of racism and bias in society. "We can make this our protest," one of the men said. "We can unite and create a movement to fight racism wherever we find it." Passengers began discussing ideas on how they could raise awareness about the incident and how they could continue their fight even after the flight ended. At this point, the replacement pilot was about to leave, and each of them knew that this moment could be the beginning of something much greater. They understood that their fight was just beginning, and they were ready to go all the way to ensure a future free of hatred and prejudice. As passengers gathered around the pregnant woman to support her, the deputy chief joined them. He entered the cabin with a serious expression, instantly attracting attention. "Good afternoon," he said, looking around at the passengers. "I know there's been an unfortunate incident, and I'm here to sort it out. We want to hear from you exactly what happened." The passengers, exchanging glances, began to recount the events that had led up to this moment. One by one, they shared their stories, their voices confident and determined. The pilot refused to fly when he found out there was a pregnant black woman on board. One of the passengers began. He said he couldn't work with her. The deputy chief listened attentively, his expression becoming more and more focused. He nodded, noting the importance of each word. "This is unacceptable," he said, and there was determination in his voice. "I promise you this will be investigated. We do not tolerate bias or racism in any form at the airline." The passengers felt a surge of hope. They knew that their words had now been heard, and this gave them confidence that change could happen. "What can we do to help?" asked the woman who first approached the pregnant woman. "We want this incident not to go unnoticed," the deputy chief replied. "We are going to collect all your evidence and record this incident. In addition, I suggest you write letters to the airline so that we can understand how this affected you." Discussions broke out among the passengers. They realized that now they had the opportunity not only to defend their rights, but also to create a movement that would help others who had faced similar situations. "Let's create a group where we can pool our efforts," one of the men suggested. "We can use social media to get this story out to everyone." "That's a great idea," others echoed. "We need to show that we're not just victims, but fighters for justice." At that moment, the pregnant woman felt excitement rising again. She finally began to understand that her story could help others. This was not just her personal struggle, but an opportunity to change the world for the better. "I want my child to grow up in a world free of hatred and prejudice," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We must make sure this doesn't happen again." The deputy chief nodded, his eyes flashing with respect. "Your words matter, and this is how we can make a difference. We must unite to make our voices heard." As passengers discussed their ideas, the atmosphere in the cabin became increasingly inspiring. They understood that their unity and determination could be a powerful tool in the fight against racism and bias. At this moment, one of the passengers raised his hand. "We can organize a meeting in our city to discuss how we can continue this fight. It should not just be a talk, but also an action." "Yes," the others replied, their faces glowing with enthusiasm. "We can encourage other people to join us. The more of us there are, the more attention we can bring to this problem." Meanwhile, Flight attendants who were also affected by the incident began gathering information about the incident. They were actively discussing how they could improve diversity and inclusion training to prevent similar incidents from happening again. "We need to change our policies," one flight attendant said. "It's important that all crew members understand that hate and bias will not be tolerated." Passengers felt their efforts were starting to pay off, and conversations about the importance of creating safe spaces for everyone became more and more urgent. "Let's make our flight a symbol of change," said one passenger. "This is our chance to change not only the airline, but society as a whole." The man's words filled the cabin, and the passengers began to applaud, realizing that they were not just victims, but active participants in this fight. Their unity strengthened their resolve, and each of them knew that they could make a difference. The pregnant woman, looking at her defenders, felt that she was not alone. She realized that all these people were ready to support her, and this gave her strength. The pilot's situation, which had once seemed hopeless, was now becoming a catalyst for change. Each of them knew the fight was not over, but now they were not only ready to fight, but also confident in their ability to change the world for the better. As emotions subsided and passengers discussed their plans for the future, tension returned to the cabin. Flight attendants, who had been actively communicating with the deputy chief, approached each passenger to gather testimonies and offer support. The air was filled with hope, but also anxiety. Everyone understood that the upcoming fight could be difficult. In the midst of all this fuss, the pregnant woman they were all supporting felt the need to have a private conversation with the deputy chief. She came closer and, stumbling a little, said, "I know we're going to fight bias, but I don't want my story to be used just for attention. I want us to actually make a difference." The deputy chief, listening to her attentively, nodded. "Your story is important and can send a powerful message, but it is important that it serves not only to change the airline's policies, but also to inspire others to fight hatred and racism in society." She nodded, realizing that her feelings could be used as a powerful tool. She noticed other passengers starting to approach them to see how they could help. "I want people to know that this incident is not just about me," she continued. "It's about how we can all be better and how we need to work together to create a safe world for future generations." The passengers encouraged her. Their support was enough to make her feel more confident. At this time, one of the stewards came out to the passengers again to tell them some important news. "We have collected all your evidence and sent it to the control office. At this time, we are suspending the pilot's actions, and he will be checked for compliance with our standards." The news was met with cheers from the passengers, who exchanged hopeful glances and knew they had taken a major step towards change. "This is just the beginning," said one of the men who was actively involved in the discussions. "We need to create a movement that will grow and develop to bring more attention to the problems of racism and bias in society." Excitement filled the atmosphere and people began discussing ideas about how they could expand their influence. "Let's create a group on social media," the woman suggested. "We can share our stories, support each other, and encourage others to join our fight. And we can organize a rally," another passenger chimed in. "Let's gather people to show that we will not remain silent." The words resonated, and soon each of them was full of ideas about how to continue the fight. They began to make a list of actions they would take after the voyage was over. Meanwhile, the pregnant woman, watching all this energy, felt her fears recede. She understood that her story could help many, and that this fight was becoming her personal call to action. "We must all be a voice for those who cannot speak," she said. "We must use our power to help others who face racism and bias." This message resounded in the minds of all the passengers. They felt that they now had a purpose, and this purpose was higher than their own experiences. With every word spoken in the salon, they became more and more unique. People exchanged contacts to stay in touch, share information and inspire each other. When the flight finally landed, everyone knew their work had just begun. Passengers left the plane full of determination and hope, knowing that they could make a difference in society. As they exited, they were met by a group of journalists who had already heard about the incident. They ran up to the passengers with cameras and microphones, ready to record their stories. "What can you tell us about what happened?" one of the reporters asked, pointing her lens at them. The passengers began to share their experiences, talking about the importance of standing up for the rights of every human being. Soon the conversation turned into a powerful manifesto of unity and hope that united them all. As they left the airport, each of them knew that their voices would now be heard. This was the beginning of their movement, and they were ready to move forward, fighting for what they believed in. Gathered in a small group, they discussed how to proceed. They knew that this was only the first step on a long road to change. But now, full of determination and unity, they were ready to move forward, defending their rights and the rights of others. After landing, the passengers left the airport full of emotion and determination. But this story was just beginning. The excitement and joy of having overcome difficulties together mixed with the anticipation of the upcoming challenges. Each of them felt that this moment was a turning point in their lives. Gathered in a small group outside the airport, they discussed how they should continue their fight. The sun was already setting below the horizon, and the sky was starting to glow with a soft evening light. The atmosphere was permeated with a sense of unity and hope. "We need to create a platform," one of the passengers suggested. Stepping forward, "We can start with social media to share our stories and encourage people to come together. And we can organize a rally," another passenger added. "But we need as many people as possible to know about it. It's not just about our incident, it's about everyone who experiences racism and bias." The idea began to evolve. They began to discuss how to use their personal connections and opportunities to attract more people to this movement. Each passenger felt part of something bigger, and this gave them strength. "I can create a Facebook and Instagram page," the girl with the bright hair suggested. "We can use hashtags so people can share their stories and support each other." "That's a great idea," the others agreed. "Let's call it United for Equality." With each new proposal, their enthusiasm only grew. They began to develop a logo and slogans that would attract attention to their movement. Each understood that their goals were important not only for themselves, but also for future generations. Meanwhile, the pregnant woman at the center of it all felt her heart swell with pride. She knew her story could help so many people, and now she felt supported by all these people. "I want our stories to be more than just words, but to become a movement," she said with determination, "so that people who experience bias know they are not alone." Their conversations evolved into constructive discussions about how to organize their first event. They began sharing their connections to local organizations and communities that could help advance their goals. "We can contact local activists and human rights groups," one of the men suggested. "They can help us organize a rally and attract media attention." Their passion and determination were infectious. Other passers-by, noticing their discussion, stopped and asked what was going on. Passengers shared their experiences, and soon more people began to approach them, ready to support the movement. One woman who joined their conversation said, "I heard about your incident. I have also experienced racism in my life, and it is very important to me that people begin to understand how it affects us. We have to talk about this," added another. "People need to know that things like this happen every day and we can't stay silent." Gathered in a circle, they began to share their personal stories. Each testimony added strength to their unity. It was the moment when they realized that they were on the right path and that their actions could change society. Once they agreed on the first steps, their faces lit up with hope. They understood that this was only the beginning, and that together they could create a powerful movement that would contribute to changes in society. Soon they began writing posts on social media, emphasizing the importance of their mission. Every new message and every new person who joined them became a step forward towards their common goal. The pregnant woman watched this process with a smile, realizing that her fears were gradually disappearing. She felt that she now had the strength and support that would help her move forward. "Let's meet again in a week," one of the men suggested. "We can discuss how our work is going and perhaps set dates for a meeting." Everyone agreed, and their meeting ended with a sense of unity and determination. Each of them understood that they were no longer just passengers, but active participants in a fight for equality and justice. As they went home, each of them felt that their actions could lead to real change. There was a struggle ahead, but now they knew they were not alone. Each of them was ready to stand up for truth and justice, and their movement was just beginning. A week passed, and the atmosphere around the new group of like-minded people grew more intense with each passing day. Each of them was full of determination, and the anticipation of the upcoming rally made their hearts beat faster. They used social media to share their stories, and soon new people joined them, ready to support them in the fight against racism and bias. With each new post, the group grew, and their messages attracted the attention of local media. Journalists who were aware of the incident began to take an interest in the passenger's story, and soon they had their own platforms to report on what was happening. Passengers who were once just sitting on the same plane are now a symbol of change. Their bond, based on a shared tragedy, has created a strong community ready to fight for justice. On the day of the rally, sunlight flooded the square where people had gathered to support the United for Equality movement. The pregnant woman at the center of the story stood on the stage, surrounded by her supporters. She felt a surge of excitement and support as the eyes of the crowd turned to her. "This isn't just my story," she said, raising her voice for all to hear. "This is the story of every one of us who has experienced bias and hatred. We are here to say, enough! We demand change." The crowd responded with loud applause, and her words echoed in the hearts of the people standing around her. Everyone felt like they were becoming part of something bigger. Meanwhile, other protesters shared their stories, raising important issues about racism and discrimination. People from all over the city came together to support each other and demand justice. "I never thought I would face racism in my city," one woman began, her voice shaking with emotion. "But now I realize it's happening everywhere, and we can't stay silent. We have to speak up. We have to fight." Each speech was met with applause and cheers. The rally became a symbol of hope and unity, and the gathering of people a powerful reminder that change is possible when everyone comes together. But amidst all this joy and unity, there was also fear. The passengers knew that their actions could cause discontent and even aggression from those who resisted the change. This knowledge made their hearts beat faster, but instead of retreating, they only grew stronger. Suddenly, shouts began to break out in the crowd. Several people, clearly unhappy with what was happening, came closer to express their displeasure. They shouted insults, and this hatred began to fill the space around them. "You have no right to talk like that," one of the protesters shouted, addressing a pregnant woman. "Nobody cares about your problems." At this point, the atmosphere became tense. Passengers and spectators, noticing the aggression, began to gather around, forming a protective circle. "We will not remain silent," one of the protesters shouted, clenching her fists. "We are here to speak the truth, and we will not let you stop us." Every word filled the people with determination. They began to rise up and speak out for each other, ready to defend their rights and freedoms. The pregnant woman, watching this, felt a strength building inside her. She knew that this was not just her fight, but the fight of everyone who had ever faced hatred. "We have come together to support each other," she said, raising her hand to the crowd, "and we will not let hatred tear our unity apart." Their voices merged into a powerful chorus that drowned out the cries of their opponents. The crowd became more and more united, and this feeling of unity allowed each of them to feel that they could overcome any difficulties. Finally, local police, hearing the commotion and realizing that the situation could get out of control, approached the protesters. They wanted to make sure everyone remained safe. "Please remain calm," one of the officers said to the crowd. "We are here to protect you and maintain order." The pregnant woman, realizing the importance of maintaining peace, approached the police and said, "We are here to express our feelings and demand justice. We do not want violence, but we demand that our voices be heard." Her words resonated in the silence, and the people around her felt how their unity could become not only strength, but also a bridge for dialogue. The police nodded in understanding. They knew that the rally was taking place in a peaceful atmosphere, and that was the main goal of each participant. "We will support your right to express your opinion," the officer said. "The main thing is to stay safe and do not give in to provocations." As if inspired by this statement, people began chanting slogans again. This was their time, their chance to express their ideas and change the world. As the rally continued, each speech and story confirmed that together they could make a big difference. As one unit, they stood ready to fight for justice and equality, and every second of the day became a milestone in their fight. As the rally continued, there was a sense of determination and unity in the air. The crowd, united by a common goal, chanted slogans, attracting the attention of passers-by and journalists. Cameras recorded every speech, and soon news reports about the rally began to fly across all local channels. The pregnant woman, standing on the stage, felt her heart beat in unison with the rhythm of the crowd. She knew that their movement was becoming more and more visible, and this gave her strength. However, she also understood that their struggle was not only joy, but also risk. The crowd stood behind her, ready to support her in any situation. and this was important. Meanwhile, the group of opponents, not wanting to leave the situation unattended, continued to voice their discontent. They did not stop, but on the contrary, they became increasingly aggressive. Some began throwing objects at the protesters, while others shouted insults. "How long can you shout about equality?" one of the protesters shouted, waving his arms. "Nobody needs your struggle." These words caused a wave of indignation among the participants of the rally. Several men from the group began to move towards their opponents, ready to enter into conflict. The pregnant woman, noticing this, immediately reacted. "Stop!" she screamed, raising her hands. "We didn't come here to fight. We came here to talk." Her voice cut through the noise and the participants stopped. Turning to face her, she could see that their anger and fear had mixed and they were now lost in their emotions. "Let's not stoop to the level of hate," she continued. "We're here to promote love and unity. If we start fighting, we'll only make things worse." The crowd froze, realizing the importance of her words. Several people looked at her and began to nod in agreement. This reminder that they were here to fight hate was what they all needed. Meanwhile, the police, seeing tensions rising, decided to intervene. Officers moved closer to the group to make sure no one was getting hurt. "Please remain peaceful," one of the officers said. "We're here to protect your rights, but we also want everyone to stay safe." A pregnant woman approached the police and said, "We want to express our feelings peacefully. Give us the opportunity to continue, and we will respect your instructions." The officers nodded, realizing that her call for peace could help prevent the conflict from escalating. Gathering around her, the participants began chanting their slogans again, channeling their emotions in a positive direction. The atmosphere was again filled with the energy of unity, and the protesters returned to their original intention to fight for justice, and not to succumb to provocations. However, in the heart of each of them there remained a feeling of unease. They knew that their path would not be easy, and that confronting hatred could lead to even greater trials. The pregnant woman, feeling the pressure mounting, decided they needed to work on their movement more actively. She turned to the group and suggested, "We need to create an action plan. We need to be prepared for any reaction, and we need to have support if the situation becomes more tense." The passengers began exchanging glances, and excitement filled the space again. Everyone realized that their unity was becoming more important than ever. "We can create special support groups," one of the men suggested, "people who are ready to help if someone encounters aggression." "We also need to reach out to local advocacy groups," another participant added. "They can provide us with resources and help in organizing the next steps." This discussion became the basis for their planning. The passengers began writing down ideas, and soon they were discussing how best to prepare for possible future conflicts. Each of them realized that their fight for equality was not only a fight for their own rights, but also for the rights of future generations. Each of them became a symbol of hope and resilience. As the day wore on, the sun began to set, bathing the square in a warm glow. People began to leave, but many stayed to discuss their ideas and plans for the future. Gathered in a circle, they exchanged contacts, determined to continue the fight and strengthen their ties. The pregnant woman, looking at all her like-minded people, felt her heart fill with pride. She knew that this was only the beginning of their journey, and despite all the difficulties, they were ready to move forward. She said, "We are not alone, and our fight is just beginning. Together we can change the world." The day after the successful rally, the crowd of like-minded people continued to discuss their plans and strategies to expand the United for Equality movement. Every morning, the small cafe where they met was filled with activists ready to work on new initiatives. The pregnant woman who had become a symbol of the struggle felt the energy of the group growing, and it was inspiring. "We need more people," she said, galvanizing the group into action. "Each of us needs to involve our friends and family in the movement. We can organize training on racism and discrimination to educate more people about the problems we face." One of the participants, a young man with a bright voice, stood up and added, "I can help with social media. If we make more posts and videos about our movement, it will attract attention. People need to know what is happening and why it is important." The group agreed and they began planning how they could create content that would truly touch people's hearts. Each of them knew that it was important not only to protest, but also to educate society to change perceptions. Meanwhile, news of the rally spread throughout the city. Some residents began to express their support. while others remained opposed to the movement. Spontaneous solidarity actions began to appear on the streets, but there were also clashes between supporters and opponents. The next morning, activists gathered again in the cafe when one of them brought bad news. "I just heard that there's a counter-rally planned for next week," he said, his eyes full of worry. "They want to show that they're against our movement." The words hung in the air. Everyone felt the tension building inside them. The confrontation they had spoken of was beginning to take shape. Excitement and fear mixed with determination. "We have to be ready for this," the pregnant woman said, looking into her friend's eyes. "This could be our opportunity to show that we're not just a voice in the void, but we have to keep the peace." Another participant added, a little nervously, "We can't let hatred take over." "Yes, it is important," one of the men supported her. "We can hold training sessions on how to behave at a rally, how to avoid provocations and maintain peace." The discussion grew heated, and soon they had a plan of action. Each understood that confronting hatred required strategy and endurance. When the group dispersed, each of them carried with them a weight of responsibility. They knew that their actions could be decisive in the fight for equality and justice. The next day, when everyone gathered for another meeting, there was an air of excitement in the cafe. They began to develop tactics for the upcoming counter-rally. Everyone pitched their ideas, and once they reached a consensus, the group felt more united. "We need to create a list of demands," the pregnant woman suggested. "We need to clearly state what exactly we want to change and how." This proposal sparked a heated debate, and soon they began formulating their ideas. Everyone understood that the importance of these demands was not only that they be heard, but that their actions had real consequences. A few days later, as the day of the counter-rally approached, the activists were working tirelessly. They held training sessions, printed posters, and developed materials to hand out. Each of them felt that their work mattered, and they were ready to fight for their rights. Finally, the day of the counter-rally arrived. The streets were filled with people, and activists gathered in the city center, ready to voice their ideas and demands. A pregnant woman stood at the front, her heart pounding with excitement, but inside she felt the strength of the group's unity. When they approached the counter-rally site, the opponents had already taken up their positions. The tension was palpable. People were shouting and waving placards, creating an atmosphere of conflict. The pregnant woman stepped forward and said loudly, "We are here to show that love and unity are stronger than hate. We will not be silent." Her words brought a storm of applause from her supporters, and she felt the resolve of everyone around her strengthen. The situation was heating up and people were starting to get closer to each other. Both sides were preparing for conflict, and the young people holding the signs were full of emotion. Hatred was in the air and fear ran down the spines of many, but together they were ready to resist. One of the activists stood next to the pregnant woman and, looking at the crowd, said, "Our strength is in unity. We must be strong and show that we are against hatred, not against people." The crowd cheered her on, their cries for equality drowning out the sounds of their opponents. The pregnant woman knew this was an important moment, and everything they did could affect the future of their movement. The situation remained tense, and they knew that they had to show determination and courage now. The time had come, and they were ready to go to the end in their fight for equality. The crowd gathered in the city center, blaring their slogans and banners that made it clear, "We are not silent," and "Equality for all." A pregnant woman stood on the stage, her heart pounding, but her eyes blazing with determination. She knew this moment would be a milestone in their fight. The assembled activists created a powerful corridor between them and their opponents, ready to resist hatred and aggression. The pregnant woman looked at her team and, feeling the support and strength of unity, stood at the edge of the stage. "We are not here today to hate," she began, her voice confident. "We are here to show that change is only possible when we come together and stand up for equality and justice for all." Her words caused a storm of emotions among the participants. They began to raise their hands, showing support, and soon the entire rally merged into one powerful voice. People began to feel that this was their chance to change the world. However, the opponents' aggression did not subside. Some of them, noticing that the crowd of protesters was peaceful, began shouting insults, wanting to provoke conflicts. The tension grew, and the group standing next to the pregnant woman began to become noticeably nervous. "Don't give in to provocations," she shouted, appealing to their unity. "We must preserve the peace." Her call was heard, and the participants began to chant. Their voices grew louder, and soon the cries of hatred were replaced by mantras of peace and equality. This helped ease the tension, and many in the crowd felt the fears slowly dissipate. Fortunately, the police, observing the developments, began to set up barriers between both sides to prevent possible clashes. Officers approached the crowd and assured that their presence was intended to support the peaceful protests. Despite the threat, the participants showed courage and continued to speak out for their rights. They did this not only for themselves, but for everyone who had ever experienced prejudice. Every word spoken on stage became a symbol of their desire for change. Meanwhile, one of the opponents emerged from the crowd, clearly intending to provoke a conflict. He stepped toward the stage, his voice threatening. "Why do you need this? All your talk is a waste of time." The pregnant woman, sensing that he wanted to stir up conflict, quickly responded, "We are here to talk about peace and equality. We are not against you. We are against hatred." Her words pierced the atmosphere, and most of those present supported her. People began to repeat her words, and soon they were chanting together, "We are against hate." At this point the enemy, not expecting such a response, stopped. He seemed confused, and seeing that hatred was not causing the desired reaction, he began to leave. The rally continued, and soon a march began through the streets of the city. People walked holding their signs, and the light of hope shone in their eyes. Each step was a step towards change, towards the world they also strove to create. The pregnant woman felt her heart fill with pride. This movement was not only her personal fight, but also the fight of everyone who had ever experienced discrimination and injustice. At the end of the day, they gathered in a park for a small rally to discuss their next steps. Each speech was a reminder that their unity was strength, and that each of them could contribute to this important fight. "We must continue to speak and act," the woman said, looking around at her supporters. "This is just the beginning, and we must be ready for the next step. Let's make plans for the future and expand our movement." Everyone agreed, and at that moment it became obvious, they were not just a group of people gathered together. They had become a real family, united by one goal. The fire of change burned in their hearts, and now they were ready to continue the fight, despite all the difficulties. The story of this pregnant woman, her like-minded people and their determination will become an inspiration to many. They did not just change the world around them, they created a future in which everyone will be heard and everyone will have equal rights. They looked to the future with hope and determination, confident that together they could overcome any hatred and make the world a better place. And perhaps their fight would be the beginning of a new path to justice and equality for all. Dear viewers, we are very interested to know your opinion about our story. Share in the comments what you think about the topics raised. Have you ever experienced racism or bias in your life? Your stories are important, and we value every word you say. Each and every one of you means a lot to us, and we are grateful for your support. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and give it a like to help us continue making content that raises important issues. Have a great day. Thank you for being with us.